The afternoon felt ordinary in the quiet way late October afternoons often do. I remember the wind first. Dry maple leaves slid across the driveway as I pulled into the garage, making that soft, scratching sound they make against concrete. My cardiologist had just adjusted my medication that morning. Nothing serious, he said. Just recovery still doing its slow work. I shut off the engine and sat for a moment, letting the quiet settle. The house looked peaceful from the outside. Warm light through the windows. A little smoke drifting from the chimney. The kind of home people slow their cars to look at when they pass. I walked up to the front door and entered the security code. Red light. I frowned and tried again, slower this time. Red light again. That was unusual. My wife, Laura, sometimes changed the code when the system battery reset itself, but she usually texted me first. I stood there for a moment, staring at the keypad. Then I noticed the note. It was sitting on the kitchen island, held down by a small glass paperweight we'd bought years earlier during a trip to Savannah. I walked around the side patio door. It was unlocked. Inside, the house smelled faintly of roasted garlic and rosemary. The dishwasher hummed quietly under the counter. Everything felt normal, except for the note. I walked to the island and picked it up. The paper was thick, cream-colored. Laura always liked nice stationery. 2 lines were written in neat handwriting. I'm done with you. The house is sold. Pack and leave. I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because the words seemed too deliberate to belong in a kitchen that still smelled like dinner. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. I looked up. Laura stood halfway down the staircase, one hand resting lightly on the railing. You got the note, she said. Her voice was calm, almost relieved. I placed the paper back on the counter. The house is sold, I asked. Yes. You can't sell the house without my signature. She gave a small tired smile. I don't need it. The wind rattled one of the windows in the living room. You signed power of attorney after your stroke, she said. Remember? I did remember. It had seemed practical at the time. Temporary, in case something happened. Laura stepped down another stair. You forget things now, she said quietly. You miss appointments. You sleep half the day. I can't keep pretending everything is fine. I'm recovering, I said. You're declining. She said it like someone stating the weather. Then she added something that made the room feel smaller. We close tomorrow. I looked at her carefully. And where exactly am I supposed to go? She shrugged. You have investments. I studied her face for a moment. There was something behind her eyes I hadn't noticed before. Not anger. Not sadness. Urgency. Almost panic. I picked up the note again. Turned it over. The back of the paper was blank. I took a pen from the drawer beside the sink and wrote 2 words. Then I placed the note back exactly where she had left it. She frowned slightly. What does that mean? You'll see, I said. I walked out through the patio door without another word. The air outside felt colder than it had a minute earlier. I didn't drive to a hotel. Instead, I drove downtown. By the time I reached my attorney's office, I already had a feeling about what I might find. At 5:42 p.m., my phone buzzed for the first time. Laura. I let it ring. 5 minutes later it rang again. Then again. By the time I sat down in the chair across from my attorney's desk, the screen showed 8 missed calls. She had already read what I wrote on the back of the note, and for the first time that afternoon, I allowed myself a small breath. Because those 2 words were simple, but they meant everything. Check again. Then I turned the phone face down on the desk and waited. Margaret Cole had been my attorney for almost 15 years. She was the kind of person who never rushed a sentence and never raised her voice. Early 40s, steady hands, always dressed in simple navy or gray. People underestimated her because she spoke quietly. They usually regretted that. When I walked into her office that evening, the lights in the hallway were already dimming. Most of the staff had gone home. The only sound was the soft hum of the copy machine somewhere down the corridor. Margaret looked up from her desk when I entered. You look tired, she said. Doctor's appointment. I replied, easing into the chair across from her. She nodded and slid a glass of water toward me without asking. Then she noticed the note in my hand. I placed it on her desk. She read it once. Then again. Her eyes moved slowly to the back of the page where I had written 2 words. Check again. Margaret didn't smile. She rarely did in situations like this. Instead, she turned her monitor toward me. Let's start with the county filings, she said. The keyboard clicked quietly as she typed. The screen filled with property records for our address. A few seconds passed. Then she leaned slightly closer to the screen. Well, she said calmly. That was fast. What was? I asked. She filed a quitclaim deed this morning. I wasn't surprised. What time? Margaret scanned the line. 9:03 a.m. That meant Laura had already started the process hours before I even came home. Margaret opened the scanned document. There it was. A digital copy of the deed transfer. My name. My supposed signature. Except it wasn't my signature. Margaret tilted her head slightly. That's not even close, she said. No. She zoomed out and looked at the rest of the filing. Then she leaned back in her chair. Daniel, she said, this is a problem. For her, I said quietly. Margaret studied me for a moment. Then she nodded once. Because there was something important about that house Laura had forgotten. Something she had never cared enough to ask about. 12 years earlier, long before the white furniture and renovation plans and dinner parties started filling the place, I had transferred the property into a legal structure. A trust. Specifically, the Rivergate Asset Protection Trust. Irrevocable, cleanly structured, and very carefully documented. The trust owned the house, not me, which meant something simple. Laura's power of attorney allowed her to act on my behalf, but not on behalf of the trust. Margaret tapped the desk lightly with a pen. She can't sell something you don't personally own. I know. Has the title company noticed yet? Probably not, I said. Margaret checked the clock. Closing tomorrow morning? Yes. She gave a thin, thoughtful nod. They will. My phone buzzed again. Laura. I didn't answer. Margaret watched the phone vibrate against the desk. Do you want to talk to her? She asked. No, the phone stopped buzzing. Silence returned to the office. Margaret folded her hands. Then let's look at something else. She opened another window on her computer. Joint accounts. That part one had been curious about. For the last few months, Laura's spending had felt unusual, not extravagant, just rushed. Margaret typed quickly. Then her eyebrows lifted slightly. Well, how bad? I asked. She turned the screen toward me. The numbers were clear. Home equity line, maxed. 2 personal credit lines, nearly empty. Large transfers. Several of them. Someone needed cash, Margaret said. I studied the dates. Most of them were recent. Very recent. My phone buzzed again. Laura. This time the call went to voicemail. Margaret kept scrolling. Then she paused. There's something else, she said. She pointed to a pending transfer request. From one of my investment accounts. A large one. The bank had flagged it for manual confirmation. They tried to move this yesterday, Margaret said. I was in cardiology yesterday. That's probably why it didn't go through. I leaned back in the chair. The pieces were beginning to line up. Laura hadn't sold the house because she believed I was declining. She sold it because she was desperate. Margaret leaned forward again. Do you know who the buyer is? Not yet. She opened another document. The purchase agreement appeared on the screen. Cash buyer. Young couple. A physician and his wife. Margaret scanned further down. Then she stopped. Her expression changed slightly. What? I asked. The broker representing the sale. She turned the screen toward me. A name sat at the bottom of the page. Greg Lawson. The name felt familiar. And then I remembered why. 3 months earlier, I had walked into our garage late one evening and heard Laura laughing on her phone. When she noticed me standing there, she ended the call quickly. Just a developer friend, she had said. I hadn't asked more questions at the time. Margaret began typing again. Business filings appeared on the screen. Multiple LLCs. Several dissolved. 2 active lawsuits. And a long list of financial obligations. Margaret leaned back slowly. Liquidity problem, she said. Big one. My phone buzzed again. This time the voicemail notification appeared. Margaret glanced at the screen. How many calls now? I turned the phone over briefly. 17 missed calls. I put it face down again. Margaret studied me carefully. You knew something was wrong before today. Yes. How long? 3 weeks. She tilted her head slightly. You started looking. Yes. And I reached into my jacket and placed a thin envelope on her desk. Margaret opened it. Inside were a few simple documents. Loan agreements. Assignment forms. 1 transfer receipt. Margaret read them quietly. Then she exhaled slowly. You bought his debt. Yes. She closed the folder gently. So tomorrow morning, she said, Laura believes she's selling a house she doesn't legally own. I nodded. To save a developer who now owes money to you. Yes. Margaret leaned back in her chair. This is layered. It had to be. The office felt very still for a moment. Outside the window, the lights of the riverfront buildings reflected across the water. My phone buzzed again. Laura. Margaret glanced at it. You're not going to answer. No, she nodded. Good. Then she checked the clock. Closing is scheduled for 10 a.m. tomorrow. Yes. Margaret closed the laptop slowly. In that case, she said calmly, I think we should be there. I nodded once. And for the first time that evening, the phone stopped ringing. The silence felt deliberate. Then we both stood, because the next morning was going to be very precise. And somewhere across the city, Laura still believed the house would be sold by noon. She just hadn't checked the paperwork carefully enough. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset. The feeling was something else. Quiet concentration. The kind that settles in when a situation becomes clear enough to handle. Around 6:30 the next morning, I made coffee in Margaret's office kitchen while the city was still waking up. The windows looked east over the river, and the water moved slowly between the buildings. Margaret arrived a few minutes later with 2 folders and a tablet under her arm. You're early, she said. I usually am. She placed the folders on the table and sat down across from me. Before we go to the closing, she said, let's walk through this once more. I nodded. Margaret opened the first folder. Inside were certified copies of the Rivergate Asset Protection Trust documents. Every page had a raised seal. She slid the top document toward me. Ownership structure is clean, she said. The trust owns the house. You are the managing trustee. Laura has no authority over trust property. Correct. She tapped another document. And the quitclaim deed she filed yesterday? Invalid. Margaret nodded. But the title company doesn't know that yet. I took a sip of coffee. They will. Margaret opened the second folder. This one contained something different. Loan paperwork. The assignment of debt. A bridge loan originally issued to Greg Lawson Development Group. Margaret had reviewed it the night before, but she read the first page again carefully. $500,000, she said. $527,000 with penalties. She glanced up. And now the note holder is you. Yes. Margaret closed the folder slowly. That means Greg Lawson's lender no longer controls the loan. Correct. And Laura believed the house sale would cover this debt. Yes. Margaret leaned back slightly. So when the closing collapses this morning, Greg still owes the money. Yes. My phone buzzed. Laura again. I didn't answer. Margaret glanced at the screen. How many calls now? I checked briefly. 31 missed calls. I turned the phone face down again. Margaret studied me for a moment. You're very calm, she said. I had time to think. She nodded once. Good. Then she opened her tablet and sent 2 emails. The first went to the title company handling the sale. Attached were the trust documents and a notice of ownership dispute. The second email went to the county recorder's office confirming the filing. She finished typing and placed the tablet down. That should introduce some questions, she said. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to rise higher over the buildings. The city traffic was picking up. Margaret checked her watch. Closing is at 10. What time is it now? 8:15. I stood and put on my jacket. Then we should leave. Margaret gathered the folders and slipped them into her bag. As we walked toward the elevator, she said something quietly. Daniel, when we enter that room, Laura may try to frame this as confusion. I expect she will. And the developer? He'll try to move the process forward before anyone asks too many questions. Margaret nodded. That's likely. We stepped into the elevator. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Margaret said something else. Your silence yesterday was deliberate. Yes. Why? I watched the floor numbers move slowly downward. Because silence lets people continue revealing themselves. Margaret gave a small nod. That's usually true. My phone buzzed again in my pocket. Another call. I didn't check the screen this time. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. Outside, the morning air felt sharp and cold. Margaret's car was waiting at the curb. As we pulled into traffic, she opened her legal pad and spoke calmly. Let's think about this in steps, she said. I appreciated that approach. Margaret wrote 3 lines. Step 1, verify ownership. Step 2, halt the closing. Step 3, establish financial exposure. Simple, clean, no emotion required. We reached the downtown financial district a few minutes before 10. The law firm hosting the closing occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower overlooking the river. Inside the lobby, marble floors reflected the morning light. Margaret signed us in at reception. Conference room B, the receptionist said. The elevator ride up was quiet. When the doors opened, we stepped into a long hallway lined with glass walls and walnut paneling. Through one of the conference room windows I could already see them. Laura sat at the far end of the table. Her posture was perfect. Navy dress, hair pinned neatly back. Beside her sat Greg Lawson, tailored gray suit, relaxed posture. Across from them sat a young couple I had never met before. The buyers. Between them on the table rested a cashier's check. A little over $2 million. Margaret paused beside me for a moment. "Ready?" she asked. "I've been ready." She nodded. Two men standing quietly near the reception desk down the hall straightened slightly when they saw us. Plain clothes, calm expressions. Detectives Miller and Alvarez. They had arrived earlier that morning at Margaret's request, just in case the situation required documentation. I placed my hand on the conference room door. Through the glass I saw Laura glance up. For half a second her expression froze. She hadn't expected me to show up. Not today. Not here. I opened the door. The room went quiet immediately. Laura stood halfway from her chair. "Michael," she said. Greg Lawson leaned back in his seat slowly. "Well," he said lightly, adjusting his tie, "look who decided to join us." I walked past him without responding and took the empty chair at the head of the table. "Good morning," I said calmly. The young doctor across the table looked confused. "We were told you couldn't attend," he said carefully. "I'm very able," I replied. The title officer cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter," he said, looking between us. "We were just about to finalize the signatures." "I'm aware," I said. Laura's voice sharpened slightly. "You had no reason to be here." I looked at her calmly. "That depends." She lifted the pen from the table. "I have power of attorney," she said. Margaret stepped forward beside me and placed a thick folder on the table. It landed with a quiet, solid sound. "Power of attorney," she said evenly, "does not grant authority over assets held in an irrevocable trust." The room fell completely silent, and the title officer slowly looked down at the documents. That was the moment the closing began to unravel. Then I folded my hands on the table and waited. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. The title officer, a thin man named Peters, adjusted his glasses and opened the folder Margaret had placed on the table. He flipped through the first page, then the second. The seal on the trust documents caught the overhead light. Laura's posture shifted slightly across the table. Not much, just a small tightening in her shoulders. Greg Lawson leaned forward. "Let's not overcomplicate this," he said smoothly. "The power of attorney authorizes her to act on his behalf." Margaret didn't raise her voice. "On his behalf," she repeated calmly. "Not on behalf of the trust." Peters looked up. "Mrs. Carter," he said slowly, "were you aware this property was held in a trust?" Laura blinked once. "That can't be right." Margaret slid another document across the table. "Rivergate Asset Protection Trust. Established 12 years ago." Peters scanned the page again. Then he looked toward me. "You're the managing trustee?" "Yes." "And the trust owns the property at 18 Hawthorne Ridge?" "Yes." The doctor sitting across from us slowly pulled his hand away from the cashier's check. His wife leaned closer to him and whispered something. Greg shifted in his chair. "This is a misunderstanding," he said. "The deed was filed yesterday." Margaret nodded slightly. "Yes. A quitclaim deed filed under an incorrect assumption of ownership." Peters closed the folder. "I'm going to pause this closing," he said quietly. Laura stood up suddenly. "Michael," she said, turning toward me. "This is humiliating." I kept my voice even. It would have been worse if it had gone through. The young couple across the table were already gathering their papers. "I think we should leave," the doctor said quietly. "I'm sorry for the confusion," I told them. "You deserve a clean transaction." They nodded politely and walked out of the room together. The door closed behind them. Greg Lawson's confidence had begun to fade. A small bead of sweat appeared at his temple. "Daniel," he said under his breath, leaning toward me. "We had an understanding." I looked at him calmly. "No," I said. "You had an assumption." Margaret placed another document on the table. "Notice of dispute filed with the county recorder this morning," she said. Peters read it quickly. Then he leaned back in his chair. "I can't proceed with this transaction," he said. Laura's breathing had changed now. Shorter. Faster. She looked between the documents and my face. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. I leaned back in the chair. "I told you to check again." Greg stood abruptly and grabbed his briefcase. "This is ridiculous," he said. "We've invested time and money into this deal." Margaret's voice remained steady. "You nearly invested in wire fraud." The words settled into the room like a weight. Greg stopped moving. "What?" he said. "Attempting to transfer property under false authority," Margaret said calmly, "using a power of attorney outside its legal scope." Greg's face went pale. Laura turned toward me. "We can talk about this privately," she said quickly. "We are talking about it." Her eyes moved toward the door. Greg started walking toward it as well. But two men standing quietly in the hallway stepped forward. Detectives Miller and Alvarez. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't block the doorway aggressively. They simply stood there. Greg stopped. Margaret placed one final document on the table. "Formal notice of breach of fiduciary duty," she said. Laura stared at the page. "You're filing charges?" she asked. "That depends," I said, "on how honest you're prepared to be." For the first time that morning, the anger in her face shifted into something else. Fear. Greg looked at the document again, then at me. "You're serious," he said quietly. "Yes." The room felt very still now. The kind of stillness that arrives when people realize the situation is no longer under their control. Greg slowly set his briefcase back on the table. Laura lowered herself into her chair again. Margaret closed the folder. "Today's closing is officially suspended," Peters said. No one argued. No one raised their voice. The process had simply stopped. Greg looked at me again. "Why would you do this?" he asked. I met his eyes. "Because contracts matter." Laura spoke again, but her voice was softer now. "Michael," she said, "please." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I reached into my jacket and placed a thin envelope on the table. Greg frowned slightly. Laura opened it. Inside were 3 documents: his loan agreement, the bridge loan assignment, and the notice of demand. Laura's face drained of color. "You bought this?" she whispered. "Yes." Greg leaned forward quickly. "Let me see that." He grabbed the paper. His eyes scanned the page. Then he looked up at me slowly. "You're the lender now." "Yes." The realization moved across the room like a slow wave. Laura's voice trembled. "You can't do that." "I already did." Margaret folded her hands calmly on the table. "Debt acquisition is perfectly legal." Greg sat down heavily. For the first time that morning, he had nothing to say. Laura pressed her hands against her temples. "You planned this," she whispered. "No," I said quietly. "I prepared for it." The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then Greg's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen. Ignored it. Margaret gathered the folders. "We're finished here," she said. I stood. Laura looked up at me one more time. "You're not the man I thought you were." I paused at the door. "No," I said calmly. "I'm exactly who I've always been." Margaret and I stepped into the hallway. The conference room door closed softly behind us. And somewhere inside the building, the sound of Greg Lawson's phone began ringing again. This time he answered it. The rumors started moving through the building before we even reached the elevator. Real estate closings in that part of the city were quiet affairs. Lawyers, brokers, and title officers crossed paths often enough that news traveled without anyone raising their voice. When a deal collapsed in the middle of a closing, people noticed. Margaret and I didn't stay to watch it spread. We returned to her office overlooking the river. By the time we stepped inside, the sky had cleared and the afternoon sun reflected off the water in thin silver lines. The office felt calm again. The same quiet hum of computers. The same faint smell of paper and coffee. Margaret closed the door behind us. "She'll call," she said. "I know. And Greg. He'll be dealing with his own problems." Margaret nodded and sat behind her desk. "Let's finish mapping the situation." She opened her laptop and began pulling together the information we had gathered over the past few weeks. It took about an hour to see the entire picture clearly. 6 months earlier, Greg Lawson had launched a condo redevelopment project downtown. It looked impressive on paper. Luxury units, river views, high-end finishes. But the timing had been wrong. Interest rates rose. Buyers slowed down. Construction costs climbed. To keep the project alive, Greg had taken out a private bridge loan. High interest, short term, no personal guarantees at first. But when the deadlines approached, the lender tightened the terms. That was when Laura's spending increased. Flights to Miami, large credit withdrawals, transfers between accounts. Greg needed money quickly. Laura believed the house sale would solve that problem. But now the sale was gone, and the loan belonged to me. Margaret closed the report and leaned back. "It's all consistent," she said. "Desperation leaves paperwork." My phone buzzed on the desk. "Laura." Margaret looked at it. "You're still not answering." No, she folded her arms. That silence is getting expensive for her. Another vibration followed the first. Then another. Laura again. And again. Eventually the call stopped. For about 10 minutes. Then the receptionist called upstairs. She's here, the voice said through the intercom. Margaret glanced at me. Send her in, I said. A minute later the door opened. Laura walked in slowly. She looked different than she had that morning. Her navy dress was wrinkled now. Her hair had loosened slightly. The confidence she carried earlier had faded into something strained and tired. She closed the door behind her. What are you doing? She asked immediately. Margaret remained seated. I suggest you lower your voice, she said calmly. Laura ignored the comment. She looked directly at me. You humiliated me. You humiliated yourself. Her hands trembled slightly on the edge of the desk. This was a misunderstanding, she said quickly. The trust I didn't know. You didn't ask. You stopped telling me things, she snapped. Margaret slid a folder across the desk toward her. Let's keep this factual. Laura opened the folder. Inside were copies of the loan documents and a debt assignment. Her eyes moved across the pages slowly. Then her breathing changed. You bought Greg's loan, she said quietly. Yes. She looked up sharply. This is coercion. Margaret shook her head slightly. No, it's acquisition. Laura's voice rose. You were spying on me. I was verifying patterns. She stared at me. You don't trust me. That's correct. The words settled heavily in the room. Laura stepped back slightly, as if they had physical weight. You think this is about money? She asked. No, I said. You risked everything because you were afraid of losing it. Her eyes flickered. I was trying to help him. You were trying to rescue someone who should have failed on his own. Laura turned toward the window for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. I was scared. Of what? Being alone. The words hung in the air quietly. 17 years of marriage sat between us in that moment. Then Laura straightened again. What do you want? She asked. I want control restored. You already have it. No, I said calmly. I want acknowledgement. Margaret reached forward and pressed a button on the desk speaker. A recording began playing. The sound of a car engine. Then voices. Laura's voice. Greg's voice. You said the doctor mentioned vascular damage, Greg said in the recording. He's not dying. Laura replied with a nervous laugh. Maybe not today, Greg answered. There was a short pause. I just need the house sold, Laura said quietly. Once we close, we're clear. Margaret stopped the recording. Silence filled the room. Laura stared at the speaker. You recorded me? You left your phone connected to the car system. She covered her mouth with one hand. You twisted that conversation. No, I said. I listened. Her shoulders dropped. They were going to ruin him, she whispered. The lender was threatening litigation. I was trying to help. You were risking our entire structure. Her eyes filled with tears now. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Intent doesn't change the paperwork. Margaret slid another document forward. This is a petition for financial review and temporary account oversight. Laura looked at the paper. You're freezing my accounts? Joint accounts, I said, until everything is clear. You're destroying me. No, I said quietly. I'm containing the damage. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she laughed softly. How many times did I call you yesterday? 37. And you didn't answer. I was reading. Laura looked down at the folded note still in her hand, the one she had left on the kitchen counter. She turned it over slowly. Her eyes moved to the back, to the 2 words I had written. Check again. For the first time that day, she understood what they meant. Every document, every account, every step. Nothing had been emotional. It had been procedural. You planned all of this, she whispered. No, I said calmly. I prepared. Laura's phone buzzed in her hand. Greg again. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked slowly toward the door. Before leaving, she stopped and looked back once more. You're not the man I thought you were. I didn't respond immediately. Then I said quietly, I'm exactly the man I've always been. Laura left without another word. The door closed softly behind her. Margaret watched the hallway for a moment. Then she turned back toward me. This escalates from here, she said. I know. Outside the window, the sun was already lowering toward the river. And somewhere across the city, Greg Lawson had just learned that the person holding his $500,000 loan was now the same man whose house sale had just collapsed. 2 days later, Laura asked for a meeting. Not at the house, not at the club, not at one of the restaurants we used to visit. She asked to meet at Margaret's office. Neutral ground. That choice told me something. She finally understood the structure of the situation. I arrived early, as usual. The conference room Margaret prepared this time was simple. Oak table, 3 chairs, a small framed photograph of the lake on the wall. Nothing dramatic, nothing distracting. Just a place to talk. Margaret sat beside me reviewing a few final documents when the door opened. Laura stepped inside quietly. She looked different again. No designer dress this time. Just a light sweater and dark slacks. Minimal makeup. Her posture was careful, as if she had been thinking through every step before walking into the room. She closed the door gently behind her. "Daniel," she said. "Laura." Margaret nodded once, but said nothing. Laura took the chair across from me and folded her hands on the table. "I'd like to talk without theatrics," she said. This was never theater. She inhaled slowly. "You froze the joint accounts." "Yes." "You bought Greg's loan." "Yes." "You filed notice with the county." "Yes." "And Margaret is preparing criminal filings." Margaret spoke calmly. "We're preparing options." Laura looked back at me. "This is excessive." "No," I said evenly. "This is containment." The word made her flinch slightly. She leaned forward. "Daniel, after your stroke, the doctors weren't optimistic. They were cautious. You forgot conversations. For a few weeks. You left the stove on twice. I corrected that. You missed appointments. I rescheduled them." Laura shook her head. "You were slipping away. I was recovering." The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "I didn't know if I'd end up alone. So you built an exit." "I built stability." "For whom?" She didn't answer. Margaret slid a legal pad toward her. "Let's speak clearly," she said. Laura looked at the paper. Then she began. "I met Greg through the club," she said. "He was confident, charismatic. He made everything sound temporary." Temporary. His financial problems. The project delays. He said once the house sold, everything would reset. "And you believed him?" She nodded slowly. "I believed I needed an exit plan." "From what?" "From waiting." The word hung quietly in the room. Waiting for decline. Waiting for illness. Waiting for grief. Margaret finally spoke. "Mrs. Carter, were you aware the power of attorney does not extend to trust property?" Laura looked down. "No." "And when you filed the quitclaim deed?" "I assumed Daniel wouldn't contest it." I asked the next question calmly. "Why?" She looked at me directly. "Because you don't fight." That almost made me smile. "I fight quietly." Laura's eyes filled with tears again. "You stopped laughing," she said softly. "You stopped touching me. You stopped planning anything. I was learning how to recover. You shut me out. And you replaced me." Silence followed. Margaret slid another folder across the table. Inside were bank statements, wire confirmations, and a beneficiary change request Laura had initiated on one of my life insurance policies. It had not been finalized. Laura's hand trembled slightly. "I never submitted that. You started it." I panicked. "You planned." Her voice rose suddenly. "You can't dismantle my life over one mistake." This wasn't one mistake. The room went quiet again. Laura covered her mouth with her hand for a moment. Then she asked something quietly. "What happens now?" Margaret answered. "These are the proposed terms." She placed a document on the table. Full financial disclosure. Written acknowledgement of power of attorney misuse. Uncontested divorce filing. Laura stared at the paper. "And if I refuse?" Margaret spoke calmly. "Then the investigation proceeds." Laura leaned back slowly. "This will ruin me socially." "No," I said. "Your actions did." She looked at me for a long time. "You're not angry." I said. "Yesterday. And today." "Today I'm clear." Her phone buzzed on the table. "Greg again." She turned it face down. "How many times did I call you that first night?" she asked. 37. She let out a quiet, tired laugh. "And you never answered." I was listening. "To what?" "To who you are when you think I'm not watching." That seemed to settle something. Laura picked up the pen Margaret had placed beside the document. Her hand hovered above the page for a moment. Then she signed. Margaret collected the papers. "This becomes official tomorrow," she said. Laura stood slowly. At the door she paused. "I never thought you were capable of this," she said. I looked at her calmly. "I never thought you were either." She nodded once. Then she walked out. Margaret watched the door close. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "Yes." Outside the window, the afternoon light was fading again. The city looked calm. My phone buzzed once on the table. Unknown number. I didn't answer. Because by that point, the process had already begun moving forward. And once paperwork begins moving through the system, It rarely stops. 3 months later, my life looked very different. Not dramatically different, just quieter. I moved into a smaller condo on the north side of the city, near the lake. The building was older but well-maintained, with large windows facing the water. In the mornings, the lake looked like brushed steel. By afternoon, it usually turned a deep, restless blue. I kept the place simple. A leather chair near the window, a walnut desk beside it, a few bookshelves, and 2 framed photographs. One of my father in his Navy uniform, the other from a development project I finished when I was 35. There were no wedding photos. Not because I was angry, just because the story had ended. The divorce finalized without argument. Laura signed everything as agreed. No contest, no appeals, full financial disclosure. She kept what was legally hers and nothing more. Greg Lawson filed for restructuring on his development project a few weeks later. The debt he owed remained in place. I didn't accelerate the loan. I didn't pressure him. I simply allowed the contract to function exactly the way it was written. That was enough. Most mornings I start the day the same way now. I make tea. I sit by the window and watch the shoreline wake up. People jogging along the path. A few boats moving slowly across the water. Recovery from the stroke continued quietly too. My cardiologist adjusted a few medications. The tremor faded. My speech sharpened again. I even returned to doing small consulting work for a few firms that still like my approach to asset structures. Not because I needed the income, because I enjoy the clarity of it. One Sunday evening in early spring, my phone buzzed while I was sitting in the chair by the window. A voicemail. Laura. I looked at the screen for a long moment before pressing play. Daniel. Her voice began softly. I know I shouldn't call. She paused for a moment. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Outside the window, the wind moved across the lake in small gray waves. I wasn't thinking clearly, she continued. Greg left for Miami. The project collapsed. I misjudged everything. Her breathing was steady but tired. I thought you were withdrawing from life. I didn't realize you were protecting yourself. The message ended a few seconds later. No crying. No begging. Just exhaustion. I set the phone down on the desk and opened the drawer beside it. Inside was the original note she had left on the kitchen counter that afternoon. The paper had softened along the folds, but the writing was still clear. I'm done with you. The house is sold. Pack and leave. I turned it over. 2 words were written on the back. Check again. Not dramatic. Not clever. Just accurate. I placed the paper back in the drawer and closed it. The lake outside had grown darker as the sun slipped below the horizon. Lights along the shoreline turned on one by one. Small quiet constellations across the water. After 17 years of marriage, the end of the story wasn't loud. It was quiet. You don't erase a life like that in a courtroom. It fades slowly. In the way you stop expecting a second cup on the table. In the way your phone doesn't vibrate late at night anymore. In the way the air in your home finally feels settled. That experience taught me something I hadn't fully understood when I was younger. Strength is rarely loud. It lives in paperwork filed correctly, in signatures that are read carefully, in boundaries drawn before resentment grows too deep. You can love someone deeply and still protect yourself. You can forgive someone and still walk away. And sometimes the most powerful decision you make is simply choosing silence. A few weeks ago, I received a call from an old client in another city. He sounded uneasy. Something about a business partner and a property transfer that didn't feel right. I told him the same thing I once told myself. Start with the documents. Then I made tea and sat back down by the window. Because these situations tend to repeat themselves in different forms. And sometimes people just need someone calm enough to read the fine print. If you stayed with me through this story, thank you. Before you go, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this small community continue to grow. And I'm always curious where people are listening from. So leave a comment telling me what city you're in and what time it is there right now. 2 other stories people here have really enjoyed will appear on your screen next. If you're in the mood for another calm story about boundaries, choices, and quiet clarity, I think you'll like those too. Until next time.